Persian Gulf War was a conflict between the United States and Iraq. In August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. President George H.W. Bush then launched Operation Desert Storm to free Kuwait and ensure safe entry to the Persian Gulf for oil access. Finally, in February of 1991, Iraq surrenders and Kuwait is liberated. The Persian Gulf War was important because it shows what the United States is willing to do to protect oil and other natural resources. The Progressive Era took place between 1890 and 1920. It was a period of widespread social activism and political reform. The Progressive Era commenced as a result of poor working conditions, urban problems, corrupt leadership, and discrimination. There were 4 areas of the Progressive Reform: social welfare, moral improvement, economic reform, and political reform. There were 3 presidents who helped with the Progressive Reform, such as Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Each of these presidents helped the United States in their own unique way. The Progressive Era is important in U.S. history because it established many amendments. It established the 18th Amendment, which banned the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Also, in 1913, the 17th Amendment established the direct elections of senators. Finally, it granted women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment. Unfortunately, the Progressive Era came to a close with World War I. The automobile boom occurred during the 1920s in the United States. During that time, the automobile industry was the number 1 industry in the US. The automobile became the number 1 industry because the standard of living increased, with Americans owning 40% of the world's wealth. The average American income rose 35%. The automobile industry resulted in an urban sprawl and the growth of cities. Cities across America grew because the automobile liberated rural America. The automobile boom was important because it was the backbone of the economy. It also dramatically changed America's landscape. The Civil Rights Movement started approximately in 1954 and ended in 1968. Although civil rights was a problem all over the United States, it was mostly a problem in the South. The Civil Rights Movement was a social movement to secure legal recognition and federal protection of citizenship rights for African Americans. There were 3 goals for the Civil Rights Movement: end segregation, secure voting rights, and end racial poverty. There were many individuals who supported this movement, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. Each of them contributed their own part to this historical social movement. The significance of this movement was that it ended segregation in public places with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Secondly, voting rights were secured with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by banning literacy tests. Finally, affirmative action and the Fair Housing Act ended racial poverty for African Americans. The railroad boom occurred during the mid to late 1800s. Before the railroad boom, the national railway system was 9,000 miles, and by 1885, there were 87,000 miles of railroad. The railroad connected the states and united the nation. It also created many new towns and cities. Some of these cities include Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. Railroads also spurred on the growth of national businesses. The railroad boom was significant because it ultimately was the primary cause the West was settled. It was settled in 28 years. The railroads also standardized time and created the 4 time zones. The Great Depression affected the entire United States and ultimately influenced economies all over the world. The Great Depression began in the late 1920s and ended until the late 1930s. The Great Depression was caused for many reasons, such as overexpansion, consumer debt, failing banks, and most importantly, stock market speculation. On October 29, 1929, $10 billion was lost, and the stock market continued with a negative trend until 1933. It affected 500,000 Americans directly and millions of Americans indirectly. In urban areas, there were 32 million layoffs, and 20 million Americans were forced to bombard the nation's public and private relief assistance programs. In rural areas, rising debts and foreclosures became common. By 1935, close to 750,000 farms were lost to bankruptcy and foreclosures. The significance of the Great Depression is that it was the worst economic downturn in the history of the United States. The United States learned to be more careful with economic booms. President Ronald Reagan became the 40th President of the United States in 1981. President Reagan had all types of policies, both domestic and foreign. Some of Reagan's foreign policies took place in Nicaragua in 1981 and Grenada in 1983. Ronald Reagan is considered as a model conservative president because he revitalized the conservative movement. One of President Reagan's most important contributions was Reaganomics. Reaganomics consisted of three main parts. The first part was budget cuts. Reagan was able to cut 10% of the budget. He cut many social entitlement programs and deregulated many others. The second part of Reaganomics was tax cuts. Reagan believed that if he lowered tax rates for the rich, it would spur economic growth and create a strong economy. The final part of Reaganomics was defense spending. Reagan was a Cold Warrior and therefore increased defense spending. Ronald Reagan was an important political figure because he helped bring the Cold War to an end. Reagan also helped the economy with Reaganomics. Reaganomics resulted in an economic boom from 1983 to 1990. Finally, Reagan appointed the first woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, to the Supreme Court. The United States became involved in World War II on December 7, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. World War II formally ended on September 2, 1945. The war occurred mostly in Europe and Asia. The war was fought by Allied powers and the Axis powers. The Axis powers consisted of Italy, Germany, and Japan. The Allied powers included the United States, France, and Great Britain. World War II was a catastrophic war that ended the lives of many people. During this time, the Holocaust also occurred. It was the genocide of more than 6 million European Jews by the Nazis. By the end, the Allied powers won, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and the Treaty of Versailles was signed. World War II was significant because the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is important because they were the first and only nuclear attacks in history. The Vietnam War started in 1964 when the USS Maddox was attacked by North Vietnam. At the time the Vietnam War started, President Lyndon Johnson was in office, and by the time it ended, President Richard Nixon was in office. The Vietnam War was fought between North Vietnam and the United States. The United States was protecting South Vietnam from falling to North Vietnam. The United States waged a war of attrition by destroying and killing the Viet Cong in North Vietnam. The turning point of the Vietnam War was the Tet Offensive in 1968. The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack by the Viet Cong on South Vietnamese cities. It was very important because it ended President Johnson's political career. President Richard Nixon fought Vietnam differently. He decreased troops in Vietnam and eventually was able to reach an agreement with the Paris Peace Accords. The significance of the Vietnam War was that it established a new and more cautious foreign policy. The United States handled situations differently to avoid another conflict like Vietnam. Americans also are more skeptical about their government. In September 2017, 11% of Americans trust their government. That number was 77% in 1964. On September 9, 2001, a series of planned terrorist attacks occurred against the United States. Al-Qaeda planned these attacks under the rule of Osama bin Laden. Additionally, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial jet airlines and crashed them into prominent U.S. landmarks. The terrorists crashed 2 planes into the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 plane into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and the final did not hit its target and came crashing down in Pennsylvania. The significance of the 9/11 attacks was that almost 3,000 people lost their lives, making it the single worst attack on the United States to date. And this event prompted the beginning of the War on Terrorism and created the Department of Homeland Security.